Dear students, in this module, we will be discussing and comprehending about the testing of hypothesis, meaning and importance, and with a special focus on chi-square test. The learning objectives pertaining to this module are mainly referring to various steps involved in testing of hypothesis, the chi-square test of significance, meaning and its importance, and its usage. Testing of hypothesis, let us begin with what is its meaning and what is its relevance when we are talking about social science research and the data analysis. Hypothesis testing or testing of hypothesis is one of the major steps in social science research. As stated earlier, a large majority of the social science research aims to examine the association or relationship between one or more independent variables with one or more dependent variables for which hypothesis will be formulated. The process of testing of hypothesis will be carried out after tabulation and analysis of data by using with appropriate statistical tests of significance. However, depending upon the structure of hypothesis and the type of data involved in the dependent and independent variables, the tests of significance have to be chosen. For testing of hypothesis generally, the researchers would follow some steps as given below. Steps involved in testing of hypothesis. To begin with, we have to make a formal statement. The researcher at first should make a formal statement about the null hypothesis, that is usually denoted as H naught, and also the alternative hypothesis, which is expressed as HA or H1. This means that the hypothesis should be clearly stated considering the nature of the research problem and objectives. Next step is to work out the selection of significance level. The hypotheses are tested on a predetermined level of significance, which also need to be specified. Generally, the level of significance taken into consideration are either at 5% level, that is p is less than 0.05, or at 1% level, which is p is less than 0.01, and at times even at 10% level, that is p less than 0.10 or 0.1% level, that is p less than 0.001, are also considered depending on the context in which we need the results. For instance, if the most of the exploratory studies, if we want to test it out whether that hypothesis holds good or not, even at a 10% level such hypothesis can be tested. The other aspect which we need to consider is about random sampling and computing the value. For testing the data, generally the data should be collected from a random sample. For instance, following a probability methods of sampling taken from the universe, and then one should compute an appropriate value from the sample data concerning the test statistic utilizing the relevant distribution. In simple words, draw a sample to provide empirical data. It is very important that our sampling process should be very sophisticated and followed very systematically and scientifically, so that the randomness prevails, and also when the randomness is there, such scientific data will provide you the appropriate value for drawing inferences by using appropriate statistical techniques. The other aspects which we need to consider is that we need to decide the type of distribution to use. After selection of significance level, the researchers have to determine the appropriate sampling distribution. For instance, the choice generally lies between whether it is normal distribution and t distribution. Also, we need to know about how to calculate the probability. The probability of happening or not happening of an event is calculated, and on the basis of it, the researcher should find that the diversion between the observed and expected values exists or not, and the null hypothesis is tested accordingly. The other aspect which we need to understand is about comparing the probability. This is the last step in testing of hypothesis, in which the researcher is supposed to compare the probability calculated with the specified value for alpha value, the level of significance. This alpha value, which is used to be compared with the p value, that is tabulated value, and then take a decision to either accept or reject the null hypothesis at certain level of significance, say either at 1% or 5% as stated earlier. Usually, we need to know that among the several tests of significance, chi-square test is the most important one. Carl Pearson way back in 1880 has introduced this test to distinguish between an observed set of frequencies, how it differs from a specified frequency distribution. In that way, if the observed values are given and if you calculate the expected values, the extent of variation from the observed value indicates the chi-square value can automatically comes out, and that value is taken and adopted for the chi-square test. A chi-square test also referred to as a chi-square test, x in Greek response chi, pronounced as kyi, and square of this chi square or chi squared test is usually denoted. It is the mostly used method of non-parametric test in testing of hypothesis. The term non-parametric refers to the fact that chi-square tests do not require assumptions about population parameters, nor do they test hypothesis about population parameters. The chi-square test uses frequency data to generate a statistical test. It tests the significant difference between the expected value and the observed value, which can be used for mostly categorized data, but not for numerical scores. In the case of categorical data, this test is used mostly for two purposes, that is to test the goodness of fit and to test the significance of association between two attributes, and they are also known as tests of independence. These different tests, why we are using it is appropriately we should understand. For example, when there are two variables under focus and two categories, to what extent they are independent between each other, if you are carrying out that test, it is called a test of independence. Similarly, when you are attributing two attributes with the degree of association, the extent of the relationship that exists, if you want to measure, then if you are using the goodness of fit, is that how best the two values are going together or related to each other will be brought out. In that way, the different nomenclatures when we are using, it will give a picture to understand the extent of changes that happens in the distribution of the data. There are major characteristics of chi-square test of significance. For instance, the chi-square test is based on the observed frequencies only. It is a technique for testing the hypothesis and is not useful for estimation. For instance, if the value that comes out when you calculate the chi-square, on that basis it will not be used for any further estimation, it will only reflect on the type of relationship or the extent of association between two variables that is under your focus. Furthermore, the other characteristic of chi-square is it is useful test for research and is used in complex contingency tables with several classes that values will be decided when you are using a particular example. The test involves less mathematical detail and there is no need of any parameter values like mean and standard deviation. Because the mathematical calculations are so simple, the chi-square test is widely used in social science research and also its application is phenomenal given the attributes and also if the values you want to see what extent the association exists between two attributes, the usual common tests of significance is by using of chi-square. The other important aspect is the shape of the chi-square distribution depends on the degree of freedom, the values of non-negative, that is the values are greater than or equal to 0 is another aspect that requires. what are the essential requirements for the application of chi-square test? We need to know before applying chi-square. Otherwise, it will be widely used without having a proper understanding and also without having a appropriateness assessment. One of the important aspect of requirement is that it should be with a random sample. Though it is a non-parametric test, the study sample should be randomly selected so as to generalize the findings to the population. By using a hypothesis, when you are accepting or rejecting, it clearly indicates that you would like to generalize for the larger population. If that is the case, the sample which you are adopting, for which your chi-square test is you are going to base, that it should have a randomness. Similarly, the categorical data or qualitative data is essential. To apply chi-square test, the data should be categorical in nature, which normally based on attributes or qualitative nature. This is one of the important characteristic of chi-square. That is, chi-square is adopted widely when the data is qualitative in nature and also when you are normally your variables are attributable, so that based on the attributes, if we want to test out the type of relationship that exists, then it is common to use chi-square. The other aspect is lowest expected frequency should be 5. That is a general rule that no cell frequency of each of the categories of the variables under consideration should be less than 5. In such cases, regrouping is need to be done by combining the frequencies of adjoining groups or categories so that the new frequencies become higher than 5. Some say such lowest frequency should be as high as 10 also. So, this is one of the important aspect which we need to know. In most of the social data, sometimes it becomes difficult, so the value will become less than 5. In spite of that, many researchers attempt, that is where large number of research becomes misusing the value of chi-square, and then based on that, if the generalization occurs, it will be furthermore misleading and it is not appropriate for adopting the results and generalizing for the larger population. That is why chi-square normally is highly misused unless these characteristics are taken note by the researcher and adopt very carefully while using the chi-square test. Next is formulation of hypothesis. Formulation of null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis is also essential for the selection of the type of chi-square test. In this sense, we need to know that the null hypothesis, how you are putting in framing the hypothesis. Similarly, what should be the alternative hypothesis? They are all to be tested and presented, otherwise it becomes very difficult and also it will become a greater confusion for the researcher when the results have to be inferred. There are basics and the steps that are involved in computing or applying chi-square test. For example, the chi-square test compares with the expected frequencies with the observed frequencies. The formula for computing the chi-square value is normally chi-square is equal to sigma O minus E whole square divided by E. The O is observed data in each category, E is the expected data in each category based on the researcher's hypothesis, sigma is the sum of the calculations for each category. It is very simple to use and it does not require a sophisticated statistical equation. It is a usually for many researchers it becomes a very simple in nature for adoption. As stated earlier, chi-square test enables us to see how well does the assumed theoretical distribution such as binomial distribution, Poisson distribution or normal distribution fits to the observed data. When some theoretical distribution is fitted to the given data, the researchers are always interested to know to what level this distribution fits with the observed data and for which the chi-square test can give an appropriate answer. If the calculated value of chi-square is less than the tabulated value at a certain level of significance, the fit is considered to be a good one, which means that the divergence between the observed and expected frequencies is attributable to fluctuations of sampling. Conversely, if the calculated value of chi-square value is greater than its tabulated value, the fit is not considered to be a good one. So, it is easy to infer based on the value, so that it is having a wider usage among the researchers. Chi-square test of significance is also a test of independence. The chi-square test as a test of significance enables us to find out whether or not two attributes are associated. In social science research, this type of chi-square test is widely used one, since most of the data is in the form of attributes, and almost all the researchers will try to find out the association between one independent and one dependent variable. In that context, it is very easy to adopt, and also the calculations are so simple, it can furthermore easy for any researcher to adopt it. In summary, we can mention that when the qualitative data is used, when the values are attributes, and also when the distribution is random, it is widely used by the adopting of chi-square. Chi-square is a test of association, it is also a test for independence, and also it is also a test of significance for goodness of fit. And the formula is so simple, it is widely, anybody can use it, and also anybody can also misuse unless the researchers have a adequate knowledge in what context chi-square test can be used, and for that the type of data that is required, and also when the results are coming out, we need to know that any cell should not have a value of less than 5. If that comes out, then there is a requirement of pruning the data and regrouping, and also recoding is essential, so that with the treatment, when on the research data, you can furthermore adopt and utilize the chi-square values, so that the results can be appropriately tested, for which you need to know and also frame in the beginning the type of hypothesis. For example, you should frame the chi-square. For example, when you want to test, first thing is a null hypothesis have to be framed, alternative hypothesis have to be framed, and based on that framing, when your data comes out with absolute values, when chi-square test is carried out, the results comes and there will be a tabulated data. Every statistical table at the end, you can see the chi-square table values. We need to compare, so that your observed values are less than the chi-square tabulated value that comes out in the tables. Then you may have to say that the results are insignificant, and if your observed value is higher than the value that comes out in the tabulated value, based on the appropriate degree of freedom that comes out, then you can infer accordingly and see whether you are accepting or rejecting your null hypothesis, so that your hypothesis can be taken into consideration for appropriate reasoning and for generalization. In that way, though the test is very simple and widely used, but care should be taken in appropriate use of this, and also the way in which the results have to be analyzed and the inferences have to be drawn, so that the social data will enrich with the chi-square test. And at the conclusion, we can say that the statistical measurements have improved in a system in such a way that we can statistically present the results, and that is why empirical data will become more scientific if appropriate statistical tools are used, and the social data, when take into consideration the statistical techniques, it gives a very scientific way of presentation. That is why we need to know that when data comes out, we need to know first whether which appropriate statistical tests will be suitable, and if that suitability is there, how best we have to present the data, and by adopting this chi-square, how the results can be inferred. In that way, if the results comes out and then the major challenge is how best we can analyze and also infer from that results. So, chi-square test as a simple measure also gives us a freedom to widely use it, and the calculation is so simple it can be adopted by anybody, and also the results can be easily comparable when we are talking about the tabulated values and the observed values. In that context, the results are very common, and chi-square test is one of the sophisticated methods, especially when you are dealing with attributes and the test of independence or test of goodness of fit is required.